The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands and millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is day 2 of this very short, essentially 2-day sesshin here at Hidden Valley Zen Center in August 2018. And we'll be sharing something a little bit unusual today, and that is something of the life and teachings of Nakagawa Soen Roshi. Nakagawa Soen Roshi was a very unusual human being, deeply realized, profoundly dedicated to practice and to his students, and also a first-class haiku poet, and very, very much involved in the society in Japan of artists, musicians, and so on. He also happened to have been the very first Zen teacher of Roshi Philip Kapleau. When Kapleau Roshi was in Japan, it was on business the first time. He had been a court reporter. That was he actually had his own business in New Haven, Connecticut, doing court reporting, and was called to the Nuremberg trials in Germany, and then to the war crimes trials in Japan. And he was struck, in Japan in particular, in his off hours, he would go and be in the gardens, the Japanese gardens of the temples. And he was so struck by the deep, deep, deep sense of peace in those places. There was something that drew him deeply inside himself. And so he got curious about Buddhism. And when he went back to the States, he took some courses at Columbia University under D.T. Suzuki, actually, and learned more about Zen. Kapleau Roshi in those days was a pretty upfront guy, let's just put it that way. And he did a lot of talking about Zen, as people are wont to do when they're first discovering something like that. And eventually his fellow classmates kind of said, "Put up or shut up. You're going to talk about this so much, why don't you just go do it?" And he took him up on it. He sold his business. He let go his, wherever it was he was living, I don't recall whether it was an apartment or a house or what, and left America with the specific intention of going to Japan and, as he put it, grabbing Kensho and running back to the United States. You can't just do that if you're serious about Zen practice, and thankfully he didn't. He did get the Kensho, more than one, but he didn't run back to the States. Instead, he stayed in Japan for quite a few more years and deepened his practice, and eventually came with Yasutani Roshi's permission to the States to teach Zen students. But the first Zen master that he encountered was the Rinzai master, Nakagawa Soen Roshi. Japanese culture has traditionally been quite closed to Westerners. For several centuries, they refused to allow anyone from anywhere else into Japan, nor to allow any Japanese out to anywhere else. That has changed, and there's a certain fascination these days with Westerners, particularly Westerners who want to study Zen, which is seen as something very, very difficult and challenging to do by the Japanese. Partly, I think, because these days most Zen has deteriorated into what can best be called hazing, brutal use of the so-called encouragement stick, and whether it's Soto or Rinzai. There was a Japanese monk that wrote a book about his entering one of the famous headquarter temples of the Soto sect and training there, and It sounds abusive. There are here and there places where it's not, but they're exceedingly rare. At any rate, when Kapleau Roshi went to Japan, the person he connected with was Nakagawa Soen Roshi, who was rather unusual in that he warmly accepted foreigners. There was another foreign man, another American man, that also was there with Kapleau Roshi. And they trained there. Soen Roshi allowed them to do zazen. They were not allowed into the zendo, but they could stay at the temple so long as they did a minimum of an hour a day of zazen, and it could be any time of day or night that they were to do it. It was up to them, and they could do it anywhere other than in the zendo. And so that was his first 3 months of Zen practice in Japan. I don't think that he would have stuck it out if it hadn't been at that sort of beginner's level of practice, getting his feet wet. He knew not a word of Japanese. Eventually he became fluent enough that he was actually translating for Yasutani Roshi in Dokusan. Here and there, Soen Roshi would take him to along when he went to visit his artist friends or his musician friends, and that was right up Kapleau Roshi's alley. He loved art, he loved music. And then one day, Soen Roshi said to him, "I received a letter recently, and I've decided to take you to Obama, which is far north, to the Rohatsu Sesshin at Hoshinji." The train together, by the way, Soen Roshi spoke English. The train together, Kapleau Roshi assumed that they'd have this lovely time during the sesshin, having tea and talking about art and so on and so forth. Well, it wasn't at all like that, of course. The Rohatsu Sesshin is very, very strict. It was an immense amount of zazen. It was heavy use of they call it kyosaku in the Soto sect. And in fact, Kapleau Roshi nearly fainted from the pain. In fact, he did faint from the pain the last night, passed out. And when he woke up, Tangen, who later became Tangen Roshi, greeted him with something that was exceedingly rare in post-war Japan, and that was an egg. I think it was, of course, on rice, but still it was an egg, something nourishing for him. Kapleau Roshi, thankfully, was stubborn, and even though it was excruciating for him to sit in any of the approved zazen postures, which basically was seiza or one of the cross-legged positions. And he just determined that he was going to eventually be able to do that. And actually within 6 months he was. This is largely due to the fact that the then abbot of Hoshinji, who was to become his main teacher, Daiun Sogaku Harada Roshi, did yoga, which was exceedingly unusual for Japanese of that era. And so Kapleau Roshi learned to do yoga, and eventually could do all kinds of amazing things, turning his body into a pretzel in many different dimensions. And the whole time that I knew him, he sat full lotus with nary a sense at all that it was the least bit painful to him. Nakagawa Soen Roshi was the abbot of Ryutakuji back then when Kapleau Roshi went to stay there. Ryutakuji actually happens to be the temple that Torei Enji, Hakuin's Dharma successor, brought back to life. He had it repaired and rebuilt and built up, although he quit being abbot very soon after that because he really wanted to do his own practice. But eventually it came down to Soen Roshi, and before that to Genpo Roshi, who was another deeply realized Rinzai master in Japan. So I'd like to share with you some of the writings of Nakagawa Soen Roshi, who eventually died rather sadly. He was always doing unusual things. And one day he disappeared for several days, I think 3 or 4 days in a row, and didn't come back. And his monks began to get concerned about him, and they found him semi-conscious in the forest. He had apparently climbed a tree and had fallen, and there was a bamboo piercing his skull. He survived that, but he was never quite the same after that. And I have a story that one of my Dharma brothers told me personally that it happened to him when he went to see Nakagawa Soen Roshi, who is still alive, when he went to Japan and did some training there. And this particular man, let's just say he had a lot to work on in the ego department. And as he was about to leave his time at Ryutakuji, Soen Roshi was sitting on, it's called an engawa. It's a raised deck, narrow deck that runs around most of the temple buildings. And it's 2 or 3 feet off the ground. In this case, it was at the right height, so that when Soen Roshi was sitting there and he motioned to my friend to come over, my friend thought he was going to give some sort of blessing to him, and walked over full of it. And Soen Roshi grabbed him by the head and clonked his head on his own head. He said he had a headache for 3 days. And I never knew whether he recognized the teaching there or not. But at any rate, Soen Roshi did survive the fall and the head piercing, but again, it was never quite the same afterwards, and just a few years after that he died. But he was an amazing human being, and his writings have been collected and translated by a friend of mine, Mitra-roshi. It was before she was Roshi. She's now the abbot of Daibosatsu, as well as the, what is it? Another Zen temple in New York City, New York, not New York City. Sherry Chayat is her lay name. She is ordained, and she is an incredible teacher. She's the sole Dharma successor of Edo Shimano, and has done basically miraculous work reuniting and embracing the Sangha that was so torn apart by his misbehavior over decades. So the book is called Endless Vow, The Zen Path of Soen Nakagawa, presented with an introduction by Edo T. Shimano and compiled and translated by Kazuaki Tanahashi and Roko Sherry Chayat. Shinge is her teaching name. So we're going to jump pretty far into this. At this point, it's right around wartime, and Soen has made contact with Nyogen Senzaki. Nyogen Senzaki was the first Japanese to teach Zen in America. He was a student of Soen Shaku, as was D.T. Suzuki. Soen Shaku did some of his training at Sogenji. He was the man who basically introduced Zen Buddhism to Americans in the World Parliament of Religion in Chicago in the 1800s. And eventually, he returned and brought Nyogen Senzaki with him, and it was D.T. Suzuki who translated the talk at the World Parliament of Religions, and D.T. Suzuki came back and also, I think, lived basically pretty much the rest of his life in America. Nyogen Senzaki was, well, let's just tell the story in Nakagawa's words. It was around 1875 or 1876. A woman's corpse was lying in a remote village in the Kamchatka Peninsula, Siberia, Russia. She left behind a poem grieving about her fleeting life. A baby lay exhausted at her frozen breast, no longer able to cry. An itinerant monk approached from a huge cloud beyond the steppe, picked up the baby, wrapped him in his Dharma robe, and took him to Japan. Thus, he was provided with a Dharma connection. This orphan, of whom it was not known whether the father was Russian, Chinese, or Japanese, was raised by the family of a boat builder named Senzaki in Aomori Prefecture. The young boy heard about the Messiah from a missionary who visited the village, but he felt a strong attraction to the Dharma, and when he was 19, he read the entire Tripitaka. That's all the teachings of the Buddha and the commentaries, the psychological commentaries. His sense of impermanence grew stronger, and he became a monk at the age of 21. He studied with outstanding teachers in various schools of Buddhism, and finally the Dharma body of Nyogen was revealed under the strict guidance of Soen Roshi, abbot of Engakuji. Nyogen accompanied Soen Roshi to a new continent, the United States of America, and remained there for more than 30 years. Living among all types of people, he continued his practice with great patience. One day, about 10 years ago, I received a photograph of Master Nyogen with his white hair and look of serene composure from across the Pacific Ocean. The poem he sent along with the photograph read, "One by one, please come here, under the moonlit window with a bowl of whisked tea for a koan." But at the time I was practicing austerity, living naked in the far reaches of Mount Daibosatsu. So a bowl of whisked tea seemed far from my world. Dozens of photographs and letters followed. Before I could send even a piece of a photograph of myself, the war started, and we could communicate only mind to mind. After the war was over, I sent to Los Angeles a photograph of 13 Zen practitioners gathered around Genpo Roshi at Ryutakuji. Jokingly, I asked Master Nyogen to pick out my face from among those 13. He and members of his Sangha pored over the photograph trying to figure it out, and finally picked one face, offered tea to the photograph, and enjoyed a moment of the fragrant breeze. Then they wrote to me and told me whom they had picked, and their choice was correct. Mr. T, who happened to be visiting me, took a picture of me accepting a bowl of tea from the phantasm, Nyogen. Nyogen means like a phantasm. In this way, the 10-year-old koan of how to get to his moonlight window, thousands of miles beyond the Pacific Ocean, was penetrated. We made old times the present and made the present the past. The day for visiting the United States was near at hand. Then he wrote a haiku. Spring approaches. The Pacific Ocean will be my sitting mat. And then He wrote a long poem on reaching the United States. It's called Arriving at the Other Shore, which of course has a lot of meanings in Buddhism. The great round mirror of the boundless ocean has disappeared in the dark blue night. This boat is now speeding toward the east at 21 knots per hour, at a north latitude of 130 degrees, bound for a country of science, for a country of atomic bombs. This is in 1949. The General Gordon is a huge white dragon chewing its way through the cresting waves of eternal Aeon Samsara and shooting seven-hued rainbows across the dome of the sky. Assembled on the deck are a Jewish painter, a Canadian journalist, a Polish missionary, and a Japanese physicist. All share a bowl of tea served by this wandering monk. Do you or do you not know? Hidden in this bowl of tea is a secret more secret than all of atomic science. All things are born of interrelated conditions. Therefore, not a thing has a separate identity. Because there is no separate identity, this one bowl can contain even more than the Pacific Ocean. Not coming, not going, not attaining, thus in the end empty. In this way, even if I thoroughly penetrate into the emptiness of the 3 billion great worlds, still there is more emptiness to fathom, and tomorrow morning I will arrive at the other shore, San Francisco. Think about this. Better put it in your heart. Don't think about it. Let it perk there. All things are born of interrelated conditions. Therefore, not a thing has a separate entity. Because there is no separate identity, this one bowl can contain even more than the Pacific Ocean. All things are born of interrelated conditions. Everything we do, say, or think influences everything else in the universe. The more let go we can become, the more positivity will be born there. Everything we do or say or think influences everything else in the universe. It's important not to get stressed out about this, but it is important to recognize that this is the case and that we have a huge responsibility to be the very best we can be. And in order to do that, we have to let go of our ideas about what the very best is. Because if there's one whiff of an idea, it's already tainted. And as if to emphasize that, he has a poem for Jimmy Tanahashi. Your slightest sorrow, how dense the summer forest, my sorrow deepens. He eventually became abbot of Ryutakuji and taught for a long, long time. And it's come down to us with this book and through Kapleau Roshi as well. This inspiration to practice. What does it mean to do Zen practice? What draws us to this? Sitting for hours when we could be out doing anything else, although it's kind of hot outside to do anything else outside at least. But there are a million ways human beings entertain themselves these days. avoiding the experience of the real truth. What is that real truth? What is that deepest truth? Who are we really? Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. How can that be? Deeply enter into your belly and let this cook as long as it takes to become ripe, to bring forth profound insight. And then the job is to make it live in your life, to bring your behavior, your thought, your speech in line with what you've realized, to let go the negative habit patterns that would override it, that would cause pain and suffering. We have a few more hours left in this sesshin. It's a very short sesshin, but it doesn't take that long if we'll really dedicate ourselves. It's up to each one of us. And we can come to awakening. Hakuin used to say, you can't avoid it any more than you can miss the ground when you stamp your feet, assuming you're doing practice to the degree that you can do it. And we have a wonderful opportunity here in this beautiful zendo, this quiet day. We have air conditioning. We don't have to live in a pool of water, which makes it more difficult to practice. Unless, of course, you let go all your concerns about how comfortable you are, and then there's no problem anywhere. And thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.